7 kings. Almost all of them ended the same way, at the hands of the men closest to the throne. In 1327, an English queen crossed the Channel with a foreign army to depose her own husband. In 1520, a Danish king promised 82 Swedish nobles amnesty at a coronation feast, then beheaded every one of them in the square 3 days later. In 1570, a Russian tsar turned Novgorod into 5 weeks of drownings, torture, and bodies in the Volkhov. 7 rulers across 5 centuries who pushed their aristocracy past the breaking point. And in almost every case, the men who owed them fealty moved against them first. Our 7th king, the first to fall, lost his throne to the woman who shared his bed. The 7th wore a crown that meant nothing without the barons who enforced it. Edward II of England ruled from 1307 to 1327, and in those 20 years he made one mistake on repeat. He gave everything to the men he loved and nothing to the men who ran his kingdom. First came Piers Gaveston, a minor nobleman showered with earldoms until the barons dragged him from Scarborough Castle and drove a sword through his stomach on a Warwickshire roadside. The blood on that dirt path sent a message to every court in England. Then came Hugh Despencer the Younger, whose hunger for estates turned every noble family against the throne. Edward's estranged wife, Queen Isabella, crossed to France, allied with Roger Mortimer, and returned in 1326 with a mercenary army at her back. The king fled west. They caught him in Wales within weeks. Parliament deposed him in January 1327, the first English king forced from his throne by his own parliament. By September, he was dead at Berkeley Castle. The chroniclers tell a darker story: a red-hot iron, a locked cell, a scream that carried through stone walls. That, at least, is the chronicler's version. Edward fell because his barons had enough. The next king fell because he couldn't tell paranoia from reason, and stabbed a chained nobleman in a dungeon to prove it. The 6th drew a dagger in a dungeon and used it on a man in chains. Erik XIV, the 16th century king of Sweden, took the throne in 1560 with a sharp mind that sharpened into something dangerous. By 1567, his paranoia had names: Svante Sture and his sons. Old nobility he was convinced were conspiring to seize his crown. In May of that year, Erik descended into the prison cells beneath his castle, where Niels Sture and several other noblemen sat shackled to the walls. The air was damp stone and iron rust. Erik pulled his blade and drove it through Niels Sture's side as the young man sat shackled to the wall. His guards finished the others, including Niels's father Svante. The Sture murders broke Sweden's silence. Erik's half-brothers John and Karl rallied what remained of the aristocracy and deposed him in 1568. He spent the next 9 years locked in the same kind of cell he had once visited with a knife. In 1577, he ate a bowl of pea soup. It was laced with arsenic. Erik killed in blind rage. The next king killed with a signed pardon, and 82 names on a death list. The 5th promised peace, then took 82 heads. Christian II, the 16th century Danish king, conquered Sweden in 1520 and threw a lavish coronation banquet in Stockholm. He invited every Swedish nobleman, bishop, and burgher who mattered. He promised them safety. He raised his cup and toasted their loyalty. The great hall smelled of roasted game and spiced wine, and for 3 days the celebration held. Then on November 8th, soldiers sealed the Stortorget, Stockholm's great square. The same men who had clinked goblets with the king now knelt on cobblestones slick with freezing rain. The executions ran 2 days straight. 82 beheadings under a heresy charge that fooled nobody. Among the dead was the father of a young nobleman named Gustav Vasa, who had escaped Stockholm weeks before. Vasa raised an army from the miners and farmers of Dalarna. By 1523, Sweden had torn itself free from Denmark forever, and Christian's own Danish nobles had deposed him, exiled, then imprisoned for 27 years until he died in a cell. Christian killed with a pen and a pardon. The next tyrant's cruelty was far more personal, a king whose own blood came back to cut his throat. The 4th watched his own brother raise an army to reclaim the crown. Peter, the First of Castile, called the Cruel even in his own century, ruled from 1350 in a kingdom that reeked of suspicion and old blood. His young wife, Queen Blanche of Bourbon, was imprisoned within days of their wedding. She died in his custody in 1361. No trial, no public explanation, just silence from the court and the cold stone walls of Medina Sidonia. Peter ordered the execution of half-siblings, former allies, and anyone whose loyalty wavered for a single day. The Castilian nobility cracked down the center. His illegitimate half-brother, Henry of Trastamara, became their weapon, backed by French mercenaries and Aragonese gold. A civil war raged from 1366 to 1369, scorching the Meseta from Toledo to the border. It ended at the castle of Montiel in a tent pitched for parley. The brothers grappled on the ground. A French knight held Peter down, and Henry drove a dagger into his throat. The Trastamara dynasty began on a tent floor, in his brother's blood. Peter fell to his own family. The next ruler fell to his own people, torn apart in the stadium where he had once celebrated his triumph. The third came to save Constantinople from corruption. Andronikos I, Komnenos, seized the Byzantine throne in 1183 as a reformer, the man who would finally break the aristocracy's chokehold on the empire. The people of Constantinople cheered his name in the streets. The chroniclers praised his early decrees. Then, within weeks of taking power, he had his predecessor, 14-year-old Emperor Alexios II, strangled with a bowstring in a palace chamber. That was the pivot. What followed was not reform. Over 2 years, Andronikos purged his own court, relatives, provincial governors, anyone whose ambition cast a shadow near the throne. The acrid smell of Greek fire hung over harbor districts where suspected traitors were burned from their homes. When Norman invaders sacked Thessalonica in 1185, the nobles who remained alive saw their opening. Isaac Angelus was acclaimed emperor by the army. Andronikos tried to flee by ship. They caught him on the water. He was stripped naked, bound to a mangy camel, and dragged through Constantinople's streets while the crowd pelted him with offal and stones. They tore him apart in the hippodrome with their hands. The nobles who had once knelt before him watched from the imperial box. Andronikos fell to the city he had promised to save. The next man didn't fall to a city, he broke one and left a forest of the dead to make sure no one forgot. The second left a forest of bodies standing upright in the June sun. Vlad III, the Wallachian prince the world would call Dracula, the Impaler, ruled with one principle from 1456 onward. Terror is government. He blamed the boyar nobility for the assassination of his father and the live burial of his brother. Nobles were seized by the hundreds at a single Easter feast. Chroniclers' counts vary. Some were marched to forced labor. Others were impaled in the courtyard of his own palace, the iron tang of blood carrying across the walls. In June 1462, the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, marched an army toward Vlad's capital at Targovishte. His scouts rode ahead. What they found stopped the column dead. A field of impaled corpses stretched for miles along the road, blackening in the heat. Later, chroniclers put the number at 20,000. The stench reached the army before the sight did. Mehmed, a man who had breached the greatest walls in the world 9 years earlier, saw enough. The display stunned his army, but it would not be enough to save Vlad's throne. But Vlad's surviving boyars had nothing left to lose. They backed his brother Radu for the throne, giving the Ottomans the local ally they needed to break Vlad's hold on Wallachia. Vlad emptied a field. The last man on this list emptied a nation. The first did not wait for the conspiracy to ripen. He built an army to destroy it. Ivan IV, Russia's first tsar, the one history calls the Terrible, watched his boyars plot against him for years. In 1564, Prince Andrei Kurbsky defected to Lithuania carrying military secrets and a letter accusing Ivan of tyranny and madness. Ivan's answer was the Oprichnina, a state within the state, 6,000 men dressed in black riding black horses, sworn to hunt and liquidate the Russian nobility. In January 1570, Ivan marched the Oprichnina into the city of Novgorod on suspicion of a boyar conspiracy to defect to Poland-Lithuania. For 5 weeks, his men killed without pause or distinction. Bodies choked the Volkhov River until the water ran dark. Contemporary accounts range from 2,000 to 60,000 dead. The cold that winter cracked the bones left exposed on the ice. 11 years later, in November 1581, Ivan struck his own son and heir, Tsarevich Ivan Ivanovich, with an iron staff in a fit of rage. The wound killed the young man days later. The blow killed his most capable heir. The Rurik line would limp on through his weaker son Fyodor, and end within 2 decades. Every other tyrant on this list was dragged down by his nobles. Ivan crushed them first and died on his throne in 1584. He was the only one they couldn't depose. The price was his own bloodline. All 7 held absolute power, and almost all of them were undone by the men who handed it to them.